Hi, good morning, and welcome to Sales Stories with Nate Teske. I'm Nate Teske, and we have a great show today with a former VP of mine. His name is Mark Reid. And before we introduce Mark, I'll turn it over to my partner, Rob Sullivan. Rob?
Welcome, Nate. Good to see you. Looking forward to our conversation with Mark today. It's going to be fun.
Right on. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, appreciate you making time for this.
Yeah, I apologize if the light's a little dark. We're just starting to get a little storm here, so you might get a little flashes in the picture.
No problem. No problem, man. Yeah, appreciate you making time for this today. And Mark, before we dive in, might be good for you to provide a little bit of background. Obviously, I know you. You know, we had a call with Rob to make some introductions in preparation for this. But just for the folks listening, it would be good to talk about your background, and then we can dive into the discussion.
No, that's excellent. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I've always stressed when we have a team and was stressed to me is always credential yourself. Don't assume that people know who you are or the reason that you have the right to speak in front of them, right? So my career in sales started out right after college and I got into office equipment sales, which was a very difficult training ground. But it was awesome because we had the introduction of a fax machine. And so it was the first time that we had a sales event where you couldn't sell to just one person. You had to sell to two different people to be able to actually use the equipment. So it was very unique, but it was great. After that, it was all software and services. So ADP for several years. Then I got to work with SAP. So I got to work for an international company with just amazing, talented people from around the globe. I got to work with Oracle and again, talented people from around the globe. And I can truthfully say I was never in the room when I was the smartest person in the room. So that's a great place to be to learn, right? Just absorbing all that. I got the opportunity to work with Nate at another services company. We did support as a service. And then really my last big company that I've worked with is an AI company. And so I've got to touch on three large events in my career. And the first was where we moved from software where people built it themselves to software that was consumer off the shelf, is what we would call it. The second one was the internet explosion. So we changed the way that software was delivered and how you got software. And really, software as a service is part of that. And the last one is AI. So those three big events happening through your career and influencing the way that you sell and what you sell.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of going back in time, or Mark, I remember in the early days for me, one of the jobs that we had, it was the first big strategic sales job I had. It was telecom software, these big, complex, basically ERP for telecom companies. And the VP said, hey, whatever we can sell for more than the $12 it costs to print or produce the CD-ROMs is all profit. Well, then of course it went to, delivered over the internet and such, and now it's all primarily SaaS type solutions. Yeah, interesting how the world changes, especially in technology, because you can be at a super hot company for a while, and all of a sudden something new comes along, and your hot product is now a turd that nobody wants to buy. Which then you have to adapt and modify what you're doing as it relates to that.
Yeah, complacency is actually your enemy. The time you get complacent, the time you start to feel comfortable with what you're doing, start to get nervous. That means change is coming your way, especially in the world today. It happens so fast.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Mark, one question that we had that we really like to hear from folks like yourself is, over your 30x plus year career, what would you say is like the best sales story or best sales experience you had? And along those same lines, what made it like the best sales scenario? Could be a great client, could be a big deal you did, or something that you didn't think was going to happen that happened. Just, I mean, and there's a lot, obviously, that you've done over the years in different capacities, but would love to hear kind of your best sales story that you've ever had.
Yeah, it's interesting. You think about these things when you hear that an event like this is coming up, and there's a few of them that roll to the top, but for different reasons. And it's interesting. I have something in my office, and it says, "What is difficult to achieve is sweet to remember." And I think some of the most memorable sales events that I had were very difficult and very team oriented. And it's amazing how the people that get involved with those type of deals, stay together and stay connected. I think interestingly, one of the most difficult ones that we had, we lost. And it was working with GE back in the day. We didn't have a product that was quite as strong as the competition's, but we had a very strong relationship with the client. And we worked through a very long, arduous sales cycle of almost a year, which is just crazy to think of a sales cycle going that long. And the number of people involved were amazing. And we ended up losing that deal at the end in the executive negotiations because of the way the cost was. But I think what stuck out was how hard everybody tried from our side and from the client side to make it work. Another one that stuck out for me that was a victory was we worked with Lockheed Martin. And at the time, Lockheed Martin was almost 300 different companies. And we brought together all of those companies with their presidents, their CIOs, and the CEOs into Atlanta. And we had, I want to say, over 500 people in the audience to sell to. And it was amazing. Again, a long sales cycle, just amazing. But we actually learned and made our software look like it was coming from their divisions. And at the time, the aircraft division was the biggest one. So we learned something really cool. I like learning something about the different companies we work with. We learned something that even though an airplane hasn't started down the manufacturing line yet, it gets a tail number. So every part that is purchased, everything that is purchased, it goes to that plane, goes to that tail number. So we had to change our software for Lockheed Martin to show tail number on everything that you did. If you made a copy and it was assigned to that plane, you had a tail number. And so everybody around the world had to work on our side to get our software ready to show tail number, whether it was in the hours that an employee worked, whether it was the part, whether it was copies. You go to the copy machine back in the day and you plugged in your code and you had to say what I'm making a copy for. Everything through our software had to show tail number, even though that plane hadn't started being made yet. And they had to see how much each plane cost. So it was fascinating. It was a long, difficult relationship-based sale, but it was very rewarding for both companies.
So with that deal, 500 people in the room, how did you manage that?
Yeah, well, it wasn't me. It was part of the team, right? And so all of our executives came in from around the world, and we matched up as best we could, executive to executive. And when you're the salesperson or the sales manager in that responsibility, you're like a big concierge. You spend all of your time trying to get the events around who's going to dinner with whom, what are you going to say, what don't you say. Little things like Lockheed had just purchased Martin Marietta, and the CEO, the ultimate CEO and board had said that we will be called Lockheed Martin. And if anybody refers to us as Lockheed, you'll be terminated. And that was how they got that merger to stick, even to this day. So we had to coach our team. It is Lockheed Martin. It is never Lockheed. Don't shorten it. It's Lockheed Martin. And so we had to drive that dynamic in because that CEO was driving that dynamic through that organization at that time. We also had buttons that we printed up, and it said, "It depends." And it had a big red circle and an X through it. The feedback that we gotten from some of the people on the team was every time they'd asked a question, one of our technical people would say, "Well, it depends." So no, we won't say that anymore. We will give an answer, or we will give two answers. If you do it this way, it will happen this way. If you do it this way, it will happen this way. But we had to learn their culture and not make them fit into our culture. So it was a big deal along those sides. We had to get them as much information as they needed to feel comfortable making a decision because they wanted to make a decision fast. They told us how to sell to them, and then probably the hardest thing was getting our organization to understand the speed and the amount of information that they needed to feel comfortable making a decision.
What did they consider fast?
Well, for them, F-22 program had already kicked off and was running through, but the Joint Strike Fighter program had not been assembled yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were working through the process of that. And along in our sales cycle came an event. And this happens quite often. When an event happens to either slow down your sales cycle or speed up your sales cycle. For us, they were coming up on an event in which they got certified for the structural wing of the F-35, of the Joint Strike Fighter. It wasn't called the F-30. They had 500 wing structural engineers across the world. They couldn't find one of them to sign off in 24 hours in order to meet the contract specs. And it cost them about $30 million.
Wow.
to miss that time frame. And the CEO laid down the gauntlet and said, this will never, ever happen again. So an event like that sped up that process. It sped up the process of our executives committing to putting things into the software that didn't exist, and that they would allocate development time to get that done within a time frame that allowed them to meet their specs on the customer side. Speeding up for them time-wise meant making a decision in 2 months rather than 12 months.
Well, it's a great example too of whenever there's a criterion like that shows up, there's always a story behind it. And $30 million is a big story.
And at that time too, right? You compound that, it's a lot more money today. But yeah, I mean, and the hard part was the systems were so disparate that they couldn't find one person out of all their systems and get a hold of them.
Wow.
You know, Mark, one comment on that. As you mentioned, the company, Lockheed Martin, I called on them years ago, and we were in the sales cycle, and my person I was working with, I'd called her up, and I said, hey, I said, congrats on, that deal you guys just did. It was something like 750 million with whoever, it doesn't matter. And she goes, I didn't see that, Nate. She goes, we don't really care unless it's in the multiple billions. I'm like, really? At that point, I knew I was screwed in the deal, because the deal we were working would have saved him, a couple $1 million. And the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze for them to go down that path to even, it wouldn't get attention, which was kind of fascinating, because that's not the only company that I called on that had said that over the years. One of them was a financial services company in New York City. And the guy literally said, he goes, Nate, and this is his comment, I'll never forget this. He said, Nate, we spend more on donuts over a year than you're going to save us. I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, okay, well, that's a pretty clear, definition of what's going to get attention. So you got to, good for you for getting your deal done, first of all, because that's not an easy thing to do, especially when you've got 300 humans and 500 people involved. How do you get, I don't want to say alignment, agreement for everybody, right? It had to have been like a majority type thing, right?
Well, it's amazing when you get talented people that are connected to a cause and what they will do and how they will drive forward. And I think that's what you remember most about a deal like that, is everybody coming together, and nobody said no, or in the case, this is with SAP, nobody said nine. Nobody said, they all came along. And a lot of times it was hilarious, because they would look down at their button as they said, it depends, and they go, 9. And they would go through their process, right? So the client was in on it. And it just became one of those things that bonded everybody together. And so, the technical people felt very comfortable going to our technical people, getting the answers. We opened the kimono. So we said, hey, nobody sit back and say that's intellectual property or won't do it. We've signed everything and just let them know everything they want. And that came from our executives to their executives. So it takes a lot. But when you have people that are dedicated and committed to the whole process, it's really amazing what you can achieve.
What advice would you have for somebody who's going through a process like that where there isn't that agreement up front?
This is a tough one when you talk about where do you work and why do you work there? And, can you have the executives involved in your accounts? There's a couple places I worked where there was a couple of executives. It wasn't that they were bad people. It's just that they were very focused in an area like accounting. They were financial people and they were ROI built, and they really didn't fit or match up with the executives that we had on the prospect side. And so as a rep or as a manager, you've got to know not to connect those two. So it might look like a natural connection, CFO to CFO. Don't do it, right? Make the president to the CFO or make somebody else. And so I've been through a couple of those. But I think the other thing is communication. That's very difficult when you communicate from sales to the rest of the departments. And what I mean by that is, when you're in sales, you understand that it's an odds game. We talked a little bit earlier about baseball, right? Percentages. If you're hitting 400, you're fantastic. You're an unbelievable player. Well, if you're in an organization in engineering and you're looking at somebody that only gets there 40% of the time, that's not very good from their eyes. And so you have to have that dynamic conversation of, not every sales cycle is going to work, but I still need your best effort. And it's funny, because they also want to go through a sales cycle process, and they say, okay, if we follow this process, we will always win. And no, our odds improve. We don't always win. And so having those continual conversations, but also updating, I think probably one of the smartest things I ever saw, and that I pulled and followed was the Friday update. Friday afternoon updates to everybody in the organization on the team, what is happening with that client. And it's amazing how much alignment you can draw when you communicate like that.
Excellent. I love it. It all comes back to that one word you said, communication. And also kudos to you guys for the openness that you demonstrated. I love that idea of, what we sign the NDAs, we don't need to be holding stuff back.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough because you're trained to hold stuff back. You're afraid that your competitors are going to get a hold of it. You're afraid that these things will all go along. And when the executives say, look, we've pulled out all the stops, this is an executive relationship that we are committing to completely for both organizations. And it's amazing what can get done from there. And we locked the lawyers out of the room. Anybody that had a law degree was locked out of the room.
A wise move, no doubt. It reminded me of a friend of mine who shared that he had joined a company, and I remember vividly him talking about how the one thing that was really they impressed on him from the minute he walked in the door was trust is granted, not earned. You're here. We've vetted you. You don't have to prove yourself. Don't worry about that. Everybody needs to start with that level, which is really interesting because in a lot of companies, you clearly see that doesn't happen. People don't trust each other as much as they should.
And it's an excellent point because at one part of my career, I did have an executive that went through that training, I believe, with IBM. And people, you look at people in certain situations, they will grant you some trust, but they'll verify it as you go along the sales cycle. Other people, no, you earn it every day. You come in and every day you start from zero and you have to earn that trust. A lot of that's in IT, some of it's in finance, but that's part of a sales cycle is learning where you're granted trust and where you have to earn. So an example of that would be when I was with Oracle. We were granted the trust that we had the technology advantage over everybody else and that we probably understood technology better than anybody else. Now, that wasn't always the case, but we were granted that trust. But you had to be very careful when you were entrusted with that, not to overextend it and not to talk about things that either didn't exist yet for the commercial side or things that didn't work exactly the way they thought. You had to make sure you went through that. Other companies I was with, we were not granted that trust. When I worked for ADP, there was almost no trust that we had anything technology-wise that actually worked. We could get 2 + 2 = 4 most of the time on a paycheck, but time clocks, all those other things, we couldn't figure out how to get those to work, and we had to earn our trust all the way along on those things.
Mark, I have to comment because I started my career at ADP. I was there for a couple of years, and when I went and met with a customer one time, and the guy goes, "Oh, it's Nate from another damn problem." That's what they refer to it as. And I'm like, no, it's automatic data processing. And he's like, not for us. So
we refer to it internally as alcoholics doing payroll.
That's pretty good too.
And you have these monikers. When I worked for SAP, people that wanted to be funny or didn't like it, they would call you SAP. And I'd say, well, you do call IBM IBM? And they'd say, well, no. And then they'd start going on about it in experience. And I'd say, internally we call it simple as pie. And really what we called was sign and pray. But it's amazing how the acronyms, go along.
I'm sure those acronyms come up, after a few cocktails in the evenings after you're commiserating with peers, right?
And it's interesting too when you get to that point with the executives from a prospect or a client to where you can have those open communications, both on their side and yours. They talk about, things that don't work very well from their side. Whether it was executives at Honeywell or different places around the world, and they would sit down and they would say, okay, well, here's how it works for us inside, and here's where it's broken, and we would say, okay, yeah, we've got similar things in some areas, and here's areas that we're struggling with. We might do some acquisitions in the future to bolster our product along those lines and things like that. But those conversations really help the relationship go along because in circling all the way back to the trust, you're earning their trust by telling them where you have areas that maybe aren't 100%, but you've already thought about how you're going to get there.
So I'm curious, you've obviously done a lot of different things in your sales career. Is there anything you haven't done that you would still like to do or wish that you had gone down that path for a while?
I got the opportunity to work with a lot of international people towards the end of my career, but I never really sold that much internationally. I was usually brought in as an executive and I met with other executives, but I didn't get down and dirty and work with some of the Australian companies that we had, especially in the mining sector that was going on. We had some terrific clients or prospects that we were bringing in Thailand. They were working on a food supply where they actually put the supply for the manufacturing for the supply of integrated foods. So a lot of times there they eat foods that are what we would call out of 7-Eleven or convenience store. That's dinner. And it has to do with noodles and vegetables and some type of a protein. Well, this company got the idea that they would make these small farming areas and they would put their manufacturing in those small farming areas for all of it and packages and put it together fresh. And so hell of a software opportunity at that time, but I wish I could have been on the ground to really work with those things. I like the nuts and bolts of figuring out when two companies get together to figure out, hey, we have an opportunity to improve our business and we need some help from our partners to get there. Not along the same lines of your question, but another one that comes to mind is BMW. When they set up their factory here in the US, it was a huge software opportunity for us at SAP because they set up their factory and it's a factory that doesn't have parts. So most automotive factories have these shelves of parts. And then as you go down the assembly line, they're pulling parts off the shelf and putting them together. This was held together by software or is held together by software. So an example would be Michelin. Michelin has the tires, they have the wheels. The software tells Michelin which car is moving down the assembly line, which wheels it needs and which tires it needs. Michelin has a factory right next to the BMW factory. They put those wheels on a cart, they move them across the parking lot, and they have it there just in time when that car hits that point in the line. Just amazing stuff.
That is cool. Yeah.
And that's 25-year-old technology. I mean, that right, but that was the stuff that we were dealing with. That's a lot easier today with the systems that we have. But the batteries, the dashboards, the seats, all of that kind of stuff was dealt with independent factories or warehouses that were all surrounding or are all surrounding that factory. And it became the standard for how BMW did that across the world.
That's
Mark, one thing you had mentioned was the opportunity you had with GE and that situation. I have a question related to that, but one why I wanted to make a point about GE because years ago I worked with one of their divisions. It was the technology division, I think. The guy that I was working with, he's like, "Okay, we're ready to go." And I'm like, "Okay, cool. So, who do we work with?" He's like, "Well, talk to Sally in procurement. Tell her we need this done by the end of the month." And I'm like, "Dude, that's like 2.5 weeks away." And he's like, "Yep." He goes, "Just tell her we got to get done by then." So I call her up. I'll never forget this. The lady's like, "You're kidding, right?" She goes, "You realize we're GE?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, this fella said, we got to get it done by the end of the month. And she goes, "I'm going to kill him," because we had to get the deal done because there was a transition time that was required to on. So anyway, we ended up getting it done. And the lady had to just basically move all her priorities back a couple of weeks to get the deal done. But it's funny because sometimes monstrous organizations can move so quickly, like very, very quickly, which is not always the case. And, along those lines, I did a deal with a federal government agency years ago. And when we did the deal, they were like, "Okay, we're ready to go." And I'm like, "Okay, here's the $1 million question. How long is this going to take?" She goes, "Oh, we're going to get it done in like 2.5, 3 weeks." I'm like, "No way. That doesn't happen with the federal government." So kind of a long story, but they said, "If you follow our process, we'll get it done." And fortunately for me, the company I was working for at the time, they're like, "Yeah, we'll get this done. We'll use their forms. We'll make it easy." And everybody was working in the same direction. So it's kind of interesting because sometimes monstrous entities can move very, very quickly once, you have that alignment. But back to your GE opportunity that you said you worked on for a very long time, what were some of the things you learned on that? Because at least from my experience in my 30 plus years of sales, sometimes the deals you lose, you learn a lot more about, it could be a mistake by me, the sales guy, it could be something the tech group did, or it could be a contract negotiation problem. But what was it that you found in that particular deal that, that caused the deal not to happen? from your perspective?
It's a really good point because you can run a great sales cycle. You can go all the way through to where you're able to get a yes, or in my case, sometimes you would get a situation where you would say, I may not be your first choice, but do you see any reason why this product couldn't be able to do what you need it to do? Meaning, if you had to use it, could you use it? And if you can get to that point, then you're able to move on, right? Then nobody's going to dig their heels in and say, I absolutely can't use it. So we had gotten all the way through that. We'd slogged our way through that whole process of getting that done. And what I found out at the end was we truly lost because it was part of a bigger negotiation. And GE wanted to use this process and this contract to work with a much bigger contract and be able to get the price down. Fun fact, I only met Larry Ellison in large meetings, 20 people or something like that. But each one of us that were on this project at any one time, we'd have them on a cell phone, speakerphone outside of the GE offices talking about what was going on because he's very involved. And that's one of the things that's very cool from an executive when they get on your side, when they get very involved and they really want to have a deal happen. It's amazing how the rest of the organization falls in line. And I remember telling him, as part of this, what was going on. And I just heard that long pause and he said, update me by the end of the day. So we called him back and I updated him. I said, here's what happened. It didn't go well, blah, blah, blah. A lot of swearing and everything else. And he hung up the phone and I called my manager and I said, it was been nice working for you, but I think I just got my termination package. And he said, what happened? I told him what happened. And he called me back a couple hours later. He goes, no, you're still employed. That was just more frustration from the overall account, not frustration directed at you and your team. But that was one time I thought, okay, I really did it here.
So I have a question for you about that, because this is a really interesting scenario you're bringing up. One of the things that I coach people on is obviously in basic stuff, is understanding the decision-making process. And you had mentioned that this was being played as a pawn, if you will, as part of a larger negotiation.
And we didn't know that while it was happening, right? So that
right.
This is, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So my question is, in hindsight, if you had it to do over again, what could you have asked, like along the lines of perhaps an internal coach or a particular person or a question that may have uncovered that? Because candidly, it wasn't a good use of their time, and it definitely wasn't a good use of yours.
No, they saw it as a good use of their time because they were seeing it as a negotiation. And it was happening at a level and with people that I was not involved with, right? Their legal team. And at the time, it would have been Jack Welch and his team. So I don't think, I sleep well at night because I don't think there's anything we could have done differently. We had to follow that process. It's such a big opportunity. You got to play that game as hard as you can. Buckle up your chin strap, put in your mouthpiece and go at it, right? And some of these, I guess, really the story is that you can do everything right and not get the result that you were hoping for. And sometimes you don't do everything right, but you get the results. So sales is just part of that. It's a percentage game and you got to do the best you can. You got to put the effort out there for each one. And sometimes, you do lose, but a lot of times you do win following the right process.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, because I wasn't, and please understand, I was not questioning your judgment or your.
No, yeah.
That it was more, it's a great idea to debrief internally, personally, and say what could happen differently, even if you won.
Yeah, a great example of this that we have on the other side is there were times when we would have companies that were running or prospects running sales cycles in another country, maybe the US, maybe another country, but the headquarters was somewhere else, like maybe Siemens, the headquarters was in Germany, and we knew that the headquarters was going to go with us, SAP. So we had to run our sales cycle, let the people in the US, they wanted a US product, they said all this stuff, but we knew they weren't the decision maker. We knew we had to go along with them. We had to dot the I's, cross the T's, and do the best we could. But at the end of the day, that decision was coming out of headquarters, and they could fight it all they want, but it was going to happen. We just had to soften that process. The other thing is the sale isn't the end of the sale. The sale is just the beginning of the relationship or a different level of that relationship, right? Yeah. So once you get that contract, you're working to get that one live, and then you're working on other contracts that go along.
Well, and the same could be said for a no too, because a no is not never, it's just not now.
Or in a case, if depending what product you're selling, it may not be for a while. So they may have made a decision and that might be for a few years. And as long as that feels when you lose that decision, it's not that long. And you're working on other things and it does come back.
Yeah, Mark, you had a good point there where you can do everything right and still lose. And I remember specifically, I was working on with a very large hotel chain, and we started out. I knew the CEO or the CIO from events we'd gone to and such, and he was at another company where he was familiar with the company I worked for. So anyway, long story short, we started engaging. He's like, "Yeah, we want to take a look at your service, et cetera, et cetera." And at the very beginning, he said, "If the vendor that we work with today does this, we're staying with them." And I'm like, "No problem, got it." And my freaking gut feeling was, we're screwed if they go anywhere near that what he asked for, right? And my team internally was like, all the executives, the vendor's never going to do that. I'm like, well, I hope they don't, because he told us out of the gate, if they do this, we're going to stay with them. Fast forward X months. I remember specifically, I was on a hunting trip and I was in a location where at the time my cell phone didn't work where I was hunting, which is, by the way, Rob, that's a Ross Parr-ism. You want to take a vacation where you do not have a cell phone signal so you can really detach. So anyway, at the farm I was at, there was one spot in the driveway where you could stand and get a partial signal where you could communicate with the world, and call my lady, make sure she knew I didn't die that day. I remember calling my VP. He's like, all right, he goes, I'm going to call the guy. He goes, today's decision day, and the vendor is supposed to either give them what they asked for or not. And he called me back like 20 minutes later. He goes, we lost. And I'm like, you're kidding me. And he goes, no. And at the time, this is my VP. At the time, my director goes, because it was a VP, director, and then me as the sales guy. So everybody was engaged, right? We had everyone's in the boat rowing the same way. The director, who was kind of a newer guy, he goes, Nate, he goes, I've never been in a sales situation where you can do everything right and still lose. I'm like, dude, welcome to the company, because that's just how it is sometimes, right? And I remember thinking about that when that executive said, if the vendor does this, we're going to stay. And you don't think the vendor's going to do that, but it's in the back of your head. Hey, if they do this, we're screwed. It doesn't matter what you do. Senior management could say, hey, you didn't execute properly, or, you missed this or that, which I'm the sales exec. Yeah, I get that. Right, it's on me. But in those situations, you literally can do everything right, and something happens over here that is totally out of your control. And that's one of the things that most sales execs, and I would think, Mark, you're in the same boat, are absolute control freaks about everything. Down to on this call, we're going to have a call with XYZ technical people. Steve, the technical guy on your team, don't talk until we say, hey, Steve, what do you think? Because certain things like that, it can just turn on a dime and all of a sudden your deal goes up in smoke.
It's a great point. And the way I was coached, and I like this, it made a lot of sense to me, is I want the salesperson to be the play-by-play announcer and then bring in the other people as, the expert in this, the expert in that. But don't just turn it over to them and say, Nate, go ahead and talk to, Rob about the technical stuff. No, you have to guide the conversation and keep it going. I have one example. It is very interesting when you work internationally because things don't translate very well. And so I had one example of bringing in a German engineer to talk about a certain area. And we were talking about an area that we had to fix because of U.S. law. We have a law that we had to do things a certain way. And all of a sudden, the prospect said, okay, we need to do this, we need to do that. There was a long silence, and the German said, well, we do not support bad business practice. And I said, what he meant to say was, we don't do it that way today, but we will change.
I have to laugh, Mark, because I have a similar scenario where I was working for a company years ago, and the technology was solid technology. It was I think the technical term is clunky. It took a long time to deploy, and there was a competitor that had a better, faster, cheaper solution that was almost plug and play. So it was very difficult. We lost like 8 out of 10 deals with this particular company. Anyway, one of the technical people came over. He was one of the head guys of the software that I was selling. I said, all right, man, I laid the scenario. I said what I just told you. Like, look, we're losing 8 out of 10 of these deals because this other solution is better, faster, cheaper. This is their situation. This is their timeline. I said, help me understand, and how we're going to articulate to them, why our solution's better, and how we're going to be able to accommodate what they're needing, the timeline, everything else. I said, so what about our software is going to help them do that? He goes, because the software is the best. And I'm like, oh man, that's not going to work. These guys are basing their decision on this other solution, which we knew that with us and them is always a cookie situation. And when he said that, I'm like, well, I understand, you think it's the best, but what about it makes it the best? Without missing a beat, he goes, because it is the best. And I'm like, all right, this one I'm taking off the top. Because this deal's not going to happen. I just, I knew that. But to your point, sometimes, and I have to chuckle at your German engineering person, because when I fix something at home, I'm German, I'm of German descent. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm like, baby, I'll just German engineer it. So I had to chuckle when you said German engineer, because I do that often.
Well, I think the other thing too is we often use sports analogies. We just had the Los Angeles Marathon, where the teacher came through at the end, the very end. I think 26.2 miles, and in the last 5 yards, he wins the race. Just amazing. But I have had opportunities in the past where that level of effort all the way through the end, even if you feel like you're losing, sometimes you win. And I had one with Liberty Mutual Insurance, where on Friday afternoon I got a phone call. That you hate that phone call, but we're not going to go with you. We're going to go a different direction. Got all the details. I didn't try to fight him with it. Right, got the details from it. Called my executives, said, "Here's the situation. What can we do?" Got the CEO to write a letter. I got the letter. Got on an airplane Sunday afternoon in a snowstorm to get up to Rhode Island. Showed up on Monday morning in the lobby when he walked in. And he's like, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, we just couldn't take that no. We had to come back with something else." Went upstairs, showed him a letter from the CEO. He called a few people. We got into the meeting room, and the executive came in and said, "I've never had anybody try this hard for my business. And if you're going to try this hard, we don't even have a contract. I'm going to go ahead and sign up with you guys." So, sometimes you just have to fight through the finish line, even though you've even been told you're going to lose, just to give that last effort.
That is a great story. And such a fine line between a contract and a restraining order.
It is. And, it's amazing too. We couldn't bond a lot because some prospects keep a big distance between you as a vendor as they're going through the process. But when I showed up, all of a sudden, we had a few minutes. He wanted to find out more about my background, find out a little bit more about his background. We bonded over football. We bonded over a couple of different things. And we just talked about, how actually working together we could get this a success, and a few things they hadn't thought about. They hadn't let us into to really give us some ideas. So it was a cool process, and it was something that certainly leaving on Sunday in a snowstorm wasn't the highlight of my career, but it was an effort that you have to put in. And you have to put in your hardest effort. You can't just put in an effort to check the box, right? You have to put in your hardest effort.
Yeah. Yeah, you should be really proud. That's a great story.
Yeah.